Well, hello, Kirk. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sheldon. And how about yourself?
Doing good. It's been a little bit of time since we joined YouTube with a live stream. 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah, it's been a while. I guess we've been out and about and traveling. Last week, I guess we were in Vancouver or
Yeah,
New.
beautiful Whistler, British Columbia.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can't beat Whistler unless you don't like bears. In which case, there are some bears that just happen to walk around the neighborhood
yeah.
and cause havoc. But yeah, it was a great
You can be
time.
shopping at a store in Whistler and step out of the store and almost trip over some bear wandering by.
Yeah. My roommate went for a walk in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and right in the parking lot between our hotel and the conference center, uh, he said juvenile bear, not a cub, not an adult, but just hanging out. And then I started following him, so he made his way into a building quite quickly. But yeah, fun times. Got my first parking ticket in Whistler.
Oh, how
I don't know
much
how
was
I
it?
haven't gotten one of those before, but yeah.
How much money did you have to pay?
It was $35 if you pay within 2 weeks, or it goes up to 70. So I paid when I got home. So no,
Okay.
not a big deal. It's actually probably just as cheap just to pay for parking there.
Yeah,
It's about
that's
the
actually
same.
not bad.
Yeah.
You can just park for the day and get your ticket and
Although they were towing people, so
oh,
I didn't hang out there all day. That's for sure. But yeah,
for sure. Yeah,
wow,
getting your vehicle towed is a bit of a drawback to that
yeah,
plan.
especially rentals.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any more banter? Anything you wanted to talk about before we get into talking about original sin?
Boy, like I don't know. I can't think of. I mean, I can think of
Oh,
lots
you
of
know
things.
what? You can share your. How's your water filter?
Oh man, that is a pain. So I needed to replace the filters in my osmosis under the sink, and I had all the replacements except for one, the most expensive one. So I look all over the place, can't find anything locally. There's not. So on eBay, I find a place it's a plumbing place that sells filters down the state. So I order two, one for next time. I am tracking this thing for about 2 weeks. Starts off, and finally I see it's coming today. That was yesterday. I'm all excited because last night I was going to install it. So package arrives and I open it, and what do I see? I get this. It's a toy. It's a doll, and totally useless. Utter like of no
Just one, or did you get two of them?
no. I just got one.
Oh, that's too bad.
So I went and looked online to this company. They only sell plumbing filters. And it turns out somehow two different packages got mislabeled at some Pure Later central site in the US. So some guy who ordered this is going to have the same, he's going to open it up and all excited about seeing something like this. And instead he's going to get two filters and he won't have a clue what in the world is this for. And meanwhile, I can't think of anything more useless than this thing right here. Like I have no use for this thing.
And I did check on eBay and stuff. They're not worth anything
Yeah.
really yet.
So and I paid. If this doesn't work out, I'm going to have ended up paying $96 for this. I wouldn't pay 5 cents for it.
Oh, that's
But
good stuff.
anyways, that's
That's
my
good stuff.
filter story.
Yeah. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention, and I thought I'd ask a scientist this because it's pretty important. I saw on Twitter today, part of a thread, somebody had posted a meme that said the radius of a nuclear explosion, somewhere in the radius of a nuclear explosion, uh, it will cook supermarket frozen pizza perfectly.
I suppose, like I took actually a course in first year physics, and a good chunk of the course just dealt with nuclear war. And so part of that section was looking at how big the bomb is, what the radius is, like for a typical whatever it was at the time, like everything within, let's say, 8 kilometers or 5 miles, total annihilation. And then you can move out from there. And I'd imagine there's somewhere, some happy medium somewhere where you can actually just cook a pizza.
Well, the thing that got me is a supermarket frozen pizza. You cannot cook perfectly. Like, it doesn't matter how you cook it. Either the cheese won't be melted and crisp enough, or the meat will be frozen, or both. Like it, yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but
frozen cheese never really seems to be the same after you thaw it out and try and cook it. It's just, at least to me, I just can't.
No.
At least mozzarella cheese doesn't work well.
Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting meme.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know you've been looking forward to having this conversation, or maybe no, you're not looking forward to talking about this because it can be seen as controversial. But original sin. First, I think we probably need to define what sin is before we can determine what the first one was.
Yeah.
And how it affects everybody. So why don't we start there? Sin.
Okay, so let's take. There's a couple of there's different definitions actually provided in the Bible, and where the concept of sin is frequently discussed, much to no one's surprise. The definition. There is one definition though that applies universally to all human beings, and that is to do something that your thoughts and conscience say you shouldn't. It's a violation of your own thoughts and conscience. That's the lowest bar. And that's actually what God says will be used on Judgment Day, not some, impossibly perfect standard out there. But in general, it can be, I would define it, and it's always good to try and define these in lay people's terms. It's a violation of the ultimate perfection that God is. It's to do anything that falls short of flawless perfection, which pretty much indicts all of us because none of us are perfect. It's a term that different terms are used, but one of the terms is to simply fall short of the ultimate moral standard, which is God, who is perfect beauty, perfect love, perfect honor, perfect power, perfect justice, all of these things personified. And so it's to basically violate anything, to fall short of that. And that is the general concept of sin. It's just to violate some ultimate perfect standard, which is actually a perfectly good God.
So when I think of like perfect, I think of the word holy. Mm-hmm. And or even think of like purity. Like you think of gold, and the work, the heat, the flame that has to be put into this to make sure there's no tainting or no impurities. And so when I think of sin, I think of anything that keeps someone from being holy.
Yeah.
Somebody from being perfect. Somebody from being absolutely pure.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thing to actually think about, because let's take something, whatever you enjoy doing. Let's say you're an artist and you have this painting you're creating, or let's say you are make furniture and you have this piece of furniture you're making, or let's say you're a construction builder and you're building a house. In general, we have this concept of what perfection is, and if you're anything like me, I have never actually built or made anything that is, in my mind, perfect. But yet, nevertheless, there's this idea within us that if it was perfect, if we could actually do something that was perfect, we would be very happy about that particular thing. But we resign ourselves to the real world. And the real world is you're never going to achieve perfection in this world. And that goes even for our moral standards, the way we live, the way we think, for example. Do we think perfectly all the time? I'm not just talking about making arithmetic mistakes here. I'm talking about our attitudes to other people. Are they flawless and perfect? Probably not. So the idea of perfection actually makes sense to us, but most of us resign ourselves that it's just unrealistic. Whereas God says it actually can be achieved, but not in this life. And this is where he offers eternity, where you will live in a world where flawless, perfect beauty dwells, where there isn't even the memory of a mistake or the memory of a moral flaw. There is, in fact, it never did occur in that world, and it never will occur in that world. So when you start to conceive of a world where music and beauty and art and love is absolutely flawless and perfect and always will be so, well, that's anything that falls short of that is why we're in this world. It has to be isolated. It can't exist in such a world, and we're here.
So those of you watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Post them into the comments of the chat. Tell us what your view is on sin, how you describe it to people. Are you sinless? Are you perfect? Post that in the comments. Please don't make a typo while doing it. That would be awkward. I look at baseball. You've got the best hitter in baseball any given year. Their batting average is like less than 400. Like 40% of the time they actually get on base. And I think that's pretty close to my life in terms of at the end of the day, was I even close to perfect? Well, probably less than half.
Yeah. In fact, I would say, if we judge ourselves by ourselves, we compare ourselves with each other, then we do, all right, so to speak, most of us. But if we start conceiving of an ultimate flawless form of, say, music or beauty or love or honor or power, then I would say I'm not batting 40% at all. I'd probably be a small fraction of less than 1%. In fact, I'd probably be so close to zero, I think, just given my conception of perfection, that it would be kind of depressing if the rest of us weren't all in the same boat, where we can actually compare ourselves with ourselves and feel good about each other. But feeling good about ourselves isn't really going to do it in the end, because the faintest, like if you make something, let's say, for example, there are model airplanes that I've made, and I'll airbrush them, and I'll spend months trying to make this thing look real. And I have an airbrush, and I'll be masking off this area and just painstakingly doing stuff. If there is the tiniest flaw, then it automatically moves from the category of perfect model to imperfect. And it bothers me. You can no longer put that in my collection of perfect models. And by the way, there are 0 planes in that collection that I've built over the years, 0. So the idea of imperfection, or the smallest flaw, creates a problem if in a perfect, like say with God, let's say, for example, you have a contractor building a house or making a piece of furniture, and there's a bunch of mistakes in it. You would prefer a contractor who's sensitive to those mistakes and wants to correct them. And the more a contractor is, or an artisan is, sensitive to mistakes and wants to eliminate them, the better you feel about that contractor or artisan or craftsperson. Now, imagine God. You see, the idea here is that a craftsman or artisan must correct, a good one will correct errors and mistakes. Now translate that to God. God is the origin of perfection in every aspect of things. God must correct the problems. And that puts us in a very difficult situation, because a problem must either be corrected, or if it's can't be corrected and it's going to need to be corrected but can't be, then I will trash whatever I'm working on and I will start again. Or I will basically choose a different piece of furniture if I'm in a store, rather than the one with a flaw that I can't fix. So humanity is in a very difficult predicament with regards to sin. Somehow, a perfect God must annihilate all imperfection or correct it. One of the two must destroy it or correct it. And this is where sin comes in, and this is where the concept of original sin comes in, because the whole world has been corrupted, so to speak. All of nature has been corrupted under original sin.
Okay, so let's go back to we got creation. God said it was good, and when God said something good, it means it's perfect.
Yeah, yeah,
And so He's created Adam, Eve. They're in relationship in the Garden of Eden.
mm-hmm.
Now, I believe this is all literal. I don't think there's anything that says this is poetic or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Garden of Eden, you've got these two humans, and at this point, they are good. They are perfect. They have not made any mistakes. Now, the limits to what is a mistake at this point are pretty small. There's only been one command. Don't eat of this tree.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple trees mentioned. One is the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
One is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why did God say, don't eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil? You can eat of the tree of life. Which to me says he wants us around forever. But why can't we know what is good and evil?
So I've thought about this for years, literally. And I'll just give you my opinion on this. But it's an opinion based on quite a few years of thought and discussion. It could well have been the case that tree, there was nothing special about the tree itself. It could have been any kind of a tree. It could have been a plum tree. There was nothing about the fruit itself, inherent in the fruit or intrinsic in it, that would cause the problem. But it was the act of violating the command. So sometimes in a chemical reaction, it's going to take a long time and it's going to be expensive in terms of time and resources to get the end result of the chemical reaction. But you can greatly speed that up, reducing the expense, reducing the time, and still get the same end result with a lot less pain and suffering. And you do that by adding what we call a catalyst. A catalyst accelerates what was going to happen anyways, but it greatly reduces the expense in terms of time or resources. So my suspicion is here that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was a catalyst. God knew that even though we are created perfect, at some point we will freely choose to do wrongly. And there's not a lot to do wrong. Ultimately, there's only one other option they could have had to do wrong, and it's not mentioned there. But in another book of the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, it talks about the being that nowadays we know as Satan. But back then, he was actually created flawless and perfect and pure, and the most amazing angel of all. He was referred to as the chief of the cherubim. And cherubim is just masculine plural for what we might call in English cherubs. And cherubs, they're not like what you see on Valentine's Day card. In fact, if you saw a cherub in your backyard one particular day, you would be probably just completely overcome with terror. These are very different beings. They don't look like us. They don't look like fat little babies. He was chief of the cherubim, but he was so amazing. He was so powerful and amazing and beautiful that it says his heart was lifted up, or he became impressed with himself, and he wanted to exalt himself to be equal with God. Now, God's not afraid of competition. There is no competition for God. But the problem is that a flaw then was entered. Satan, or what we know now, we don't know the original name. It's not Lucifer. Lucifer is a Latin offshoot of a description of Satan. But this being became flawed, and God cannot allow a flaw within them, especially the most powerful being of all at that point in history. So there was the chance when he created Adam and Eve that they too could become eventually very impressed with themselves, because we're told they were created in the image and the likeness of the Trinity, of the triune God, of God himself, which is, angels aren't created like that. So there was potential down the road that you would have beings actually with enormous capabilities, i.e. created in the image and likeness of God, that went rogue, that began to imagine themselves as equal with God. As a result, God says his understanding was corrupted, not thinking straight anymore. And when you get powerful beings who don't think straight anymore, that's a problem. So this is in the back of God's mind, humanly speaking. Okay, but God knew this has to be preempted. So he puts Adam and Eve into a mortal world, or a world that could be mortal if the wrong decision is made, and in bodies that are mortal if the wrong decision is made. And all of this is to isolate the problem of evil into just this world. And he puts a catalyst there in the form of this tree, and he says, don't eat of this tree. So now they're faced with a moral decision. They have no idea what knowing good and evil is. In fact, that Hebrew word knowing is the same word used to describe what happens when Adam had physical, intimate relations with his wife. It's basically to acquire intimate knowledge of something. And this is what God would say. No, they wouldn't know. You're going to have intimate knowledge of good and evil. And that's maybe not something you want to experience, and God suggests that's not the way you want to go, but they're tempted to do that. So this tree there, instead of waiting thousands or millions, who knows how long of years, until all of a sudden some human screws up and decides they're so impressive, they'll be God. And we see that all the time today. God puts this catalyst in there so that they have to, you preempt millions of years of pain and suffering and condense it down into a much smaller, less expensive, less pain and suffering world that we live in now. Now, we all think it's a terrible world. Well, basically, if you were to stretch that out for millions of years, that would be an even bigger problem. So that's my own theory of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the moment Adam deliberately and willfully and intentionally ate of that fruit.
So, but before we go into that action, I have a couple things before I want to get into.
Sure.
So, one, God knew ahead of time what would happen, because before the world was created, the plan of Jesus dying on the cross was already set up.
That's right.
So this is not a surprise. This isn't God saying, this isn't one of those Job tests where Satan has any chance here. No. This is God knows what's going to happen, and he puts this all into plan, basically to tell the story of good and evil, and God versus evil. And so he puts this tree there. He says, don't eat of this. And he allows Satan, or the serpent at the time, we assume it was Satan or something, to tempt Adam. Well, Eve first, then Adam. Mm-hmm. But why was it important for the serpent to be there?
Well, that seems to itself have been another catalyst. I personally don't think, contrary to some, where God needs evil to accomplish his purposes, I don't think God needs evil to accomplish his purposes. But given that he knows that at some point, beings created in the image and likeness of God are going to decide one day, freely on their own, that, hey, I think I'm a God, I think I'm, whatever. God then says, okay, we will then permit this and that to happen. I will permit this and that to happen. And that includes permit Satan to tempt Eve and Adam, and then, put this all in place. So the tree was not a temptation. They had no problem. It wasn't a temptation. And the Bible actually says God is not tempted, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when they're carried away by their own desires and lusts. But Satan did the tempting, and God knew that ahead of time, but he permitted it because he knew that in permitting it, he will actually forestall a much greater evil, which is a much longer period of time of history of pain and suffering and evil before this whole plan of redemption could take place, of salvaging at least those, some of humanity.
So this is like letting a child make a mistake so that they can be taught what consequences will happen.
Yeah, exactly. And having 6 kids, we did the same thing as parents. If we knew that by allowing them to be hurt in this temporary way would actually train them and ingrain within them the importance of something that was necessary to avoid much greater harm in the future, then we would permit them to experience a certain amount of harm, temporary, because nothing, sometimes learning by experience is the most powerful way to learn.
So when I think of the battle between good and evil, I think you're frozen. I think of the story of Job, and we've talked about this previously on a live stream, but you have this conversation between God and Satan about this man who follows God. He wasn't perfect, but he followed God. He's blameless in a way. And so God sort of set that up as a proving ground to show Satan that he wasn't going to win. And Satan said, the only reason he worships you and follows you is because he's got everything. He's protected. You don't allow me to go after him. And I sort of feel like that's an example later of what was probably occurring in the garden, where maybe for a period of time, God did not allow Satan to tempt them. But like, there's nothing in the Bible to say that, but I'm just thinking that that's potentially what happened. And God knew that for his plans to happen, Satan was going to be released to allow some temptation to occur. Yeah. And in this way, in this case, he actually sort of wins.
Temporarily.
Wins the battle, will lose the war. But
so it's hardly, in one sense, he wins, but in another sense, he loses badly. But the part of the problem I'm finding in current discussions with people, even this week, even within the past 2 weeks, even with the past 1 week, even just yesterday, I had discussions with 2 different people who are not Christians, who are probably would identify as atheists, and they see a huge problem with what we call original sin. And this is where, in fact, I got some quotes here I could read that I took from both of those conversations, what they say about it. So maybe I'll throw that into the mix here, into the discussion. So
let's explain original sin. So
sure. Yeah.
So Satan tempts them.
Yeah.
They eat the fruit. They know they're not allowed to. And then they realize they're naked. They have all these excuses as to why they did it. It was Eve's fault, blah, blah, blah. But what makes it original sin? What was the actual statement that God made when he was saying, do not eat from this tree? Because it was pretty clear.
Yeah. So he went on to say, for the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And but then you notice that the day after they eat of it, they're still alive. So what does he mean? But then later on, God says that all people, that there's a point in our lives that prior to basically God's plan of redeeming or rescuing people, prior to the time where you receive God's gift of eternal life through Jesus Christ, he describes you as being dead, not physically dead, but dead in another sense, and in a very real sense. In fact, from God's perspective, it seems that the most important kind of death is one that all humans living on the planet are already experiencing, unless they've been spiritually reborn. It's a very real kind of death. Something has died inside of us. And that's what happened the day that Adam and Eve sinned. In fact, it's interesting to note that in the New Testament, it always focuses on Adam as the one who did sin, and but Eve, it says she was deceived. And the interesting implication is that she doesn't seem to be blamed for what happens. And this is a case you might infer from it is that if you honestly didn't understand, if you honestly were deceived and misunderstood and stuff like that, you are not held responsible for what you did. That could be one inference. But Adam says he was not deceived. He did this intentionally and willfully. So for him, he is held responsible for committing the first sin in the physical universe, in the physical world, and then in human history. And the first sin was to just simply eat of that tree, to break the one command he had been given, is to eat of the tree. And the moment that he did that, and the two of them were in this together, I guess, because both of them experienced the spiritual death. They died. Something inside of them died. They became impure and separated from God. There's like a perfectly holy God will annihilate evil. So there has to be this buffer between God and humanity now if we're not perfect. Somehow there has to be a buffer or a distance until he can either annihilate that sin, which means we get annihilated, or that he can, let's say if you got a disease, you can cure that disease, or rehabilitate or make pure. So that's really what his plan is to make human beings, even though they have become impure, to make them absolutely flawlessly pure in the end. So that's the original sin, was what Adam did when he willfully and intentionally ate of the tree. But the moment that he did that, they both died inside. And physical death is actually a consequence of this spiritual death. But it wasn't just that. It says also that even though God created the whole world, the whole universe, in a state that he described as very good, which, as you pointed out, basically means perfect if it's coming from God. After that point, God seems to hold Adam responsible for, he talks about all of creation, the galaxies, everything suddenly entered a state of beginning to deteriorate, becoming corrupted. Instantly, the entire universe changed. Now, people would say, wait a sec, like we know that, like science today tells us that we can only, like, information only travels at the speed of light, or at least physical objects can only travel at the speed of light. How could you possibly change the state of the universe in 1 second? That's absurd. But we know from quantum mechanics, at least theorize, as Stephen Hawking, for example, did, that there is what's called a wave function that determines the state of the entire universe. And if that wave function collapses, so to speak, due to some sort of experiment, test, or observation, it would instantly change the state of the universe. It would collapse to a simple state. The wave function collapses, which then in turn determines one of the components. The universe will collapse to a simple state. Let's just leave it at that. So that's just from quantum mechanics. That's not necessarily what actually happened. But if we know of a way that the entire state of the universe can change instantly due to the collapse of the wave function that determines the state of the universe, then it is no longer absurd to think that a simple test carried out by a simple observation or test, we could use that term for what Adam did when he took of the tree to see what happens. That caused an instantaneous state. So that's the original sin and two major consequences: the long-term destruction of the universe, and the long-term destruction of human life, including his own and Eve's, and everybody who would be born from that point onwards. But that's not the real problem. The real problem today, at least illustrated by these two atheists that I'm in discussion with, is, well, what are the implications for me as an individual?
So, when this all happens, it's instant,
Mhm.
Now there is some physical repercussions as well, consequences
Yeah.
for this. God had to basically kick him out of the garden because that's where the tree of life was, and now they don't have eternal life anymore, so they
Mhm.
couldn't eat from this tree. I'm just making an assumption that that fruit gives you, that was important for some reason. But the pain, suffering is now a consequence from God.
Mhm.
Now, it's not necessarily God created it,
No.
but God says you're going to endure this. You're going to have to deal with some stuff,
Mhm. Mhm.
pain in childbirth, pain in working the fields. They didn't have that before. Now,
Well, he's essentially describing some of the consequences. It's not like God can implement certain things that are just bad for us as a kind of refining fire for a purpose, like let's say getting a tooth filled or repaired. That's not going to be the most enjoyable experience you ever had in this life. In the same way, God will permit a certain level of pain, even bring it about for a better purpose. But
okay, so,
go ahead.
but I don't think that's the issue as much as part of this now sinful species, the human
Yeah,
race.
yeah.
What is original sin? Why is something that Adam did years and years and years ago,
Yeah.
why does it affect me now?
Well, okay. So this is where things get a little more vague and a little more controversial is what is the effect on us today? Now, one thing I think is relatively uncontroversial from the Bible's perspective, and that's kind of summarized in Romans, in the book of Romans. Let me see if I happen to have it here. Romans chapter 5. It says here, I think it's verse 12, just as for by one man sin entered into this world, that was Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all people because they all sinned. So one of the, I think, uncontroversial, at least theological non-controversies is that the death that we see in this world is a result of Adam's sin. Now, what becomes controversial is that just human death, or is it death as we see in the animal world? Let's say a lion tearing an animal to shreds and even eating them before they're even dead, and poor animals bellowing with pain and all that kind of stuff. Some would argue that that's God created the world that way. But I've spent enough time listening. I mean, I've spent time in the bush, in the wilderness. I've heard the screams of a snowshoe hare, for example, as it's being ripped to shreds by a lynx. And it's pretty hard to say to imagine God saying, this is good. This is very good. In fact, he says, I have a problem with that. But anyways, original sin means death today. But some would argue that it goes beyond that. It means that we have to sin. Like you're automatically going to sin. You're going to sin in everything you think, do, and say. And that gets to the controversial part because God seems to expect even those who have never received Christ, who have never put their faith in Christ, it says that they will be judged according to their works, both good and bad, in the last days. And this is God speaking, not what I think is good and what I think is bad. So it seems that here's the problem, is that some atheists say, well, if I have to sin, then really I have no choice. And God is simply, well, I'll read you the quotes because I'll put it, let's not put words in their mouth. Let's see what they actually say. So the first atheist this week writes, original sin is simply humanity's natural proclivity to sin. That is, he's saying we're naturally now disposed, we're biased towards sinning now. And I've actually heard that as a description of how original sin has affected us. So every human is biased towards sinning. Now, that might work as long as you don't worry about babies. And we'll come back to babies who die. But let me continue on what he says. It's simply humanity's natural proclivity to sin, which is derived from Adam's defiance of God in the Garden of Eden. In other words, all humans are sinful by nature because of Adam's choice. And this is said as much in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, which is the one I just quoted to you. But I'd like to pause here and just point out that Romans 5:12 doesn't say that we are going to sin because of Adam's sin. What it says is the results were is death. Death is the result. Now, whether that gives us a proclivity to sin or not is a different matter. But clearly, death is resolved. The other is controversial. So he goes on to say, I don't think the problem is simply physical death, since the Bible clearly says that unrepentant sinners are eternally damned. So there's a more serious problem than just dying of cancer or something. He goes on, hence, we are sinful by nature, and our sinful nature condemns us. Now, keep in mind, this is an atheist speaking here, but he seems to have read a lot of, let's say, Reformed theology or Calvinist literature. We did not choose our nature to be this way. We were created this way. Now, that maybe not quite accurate. Does God actually, in fact, there's another issue here in that people assume that the way I am is the way God created me. So if I like, let's say, for example, if I really enjoy, like one guy says, I enjoy sex with a lot of different women, not just one, because that's the way God, and I need that because God created me that way. Well, okay, we're going to have to talk about that. But here he's talking about in a more general sense that God created us this way. I don't think so. But let's move on. He says, if we have no choice but to be sinful, then we do not have free will. We can make individual choices, but our very nature, which in brackets he says, which is dictated by God, condemns us to be inevitably sinful. Now, the dictated by God, I realize that a lot of theologians are going to be squirming at what this guy writes here, but let's just move on. I do believe most theologians would agree with me that original sin inherited from Adam condemns all of humanity and that we can only be saved through faith in Jesus. And then he says, a note on the hardening of hearts. It just seems silly to me that God would create people he knows will be damned anyway. That just seems rather cruel. So there's actually quite a few controversial things he says there, but the next guy writes, and it's much shorter. He says, I never chose to sin. I was born that way in a universe with rules that were ultimately created by God. Therefore, all the things that all the things that exist that way are caused by God. Since the cause is before me, it couldn't be caused by me. If you say that I did choose to sin, well, I didn't choose to be created in such a way that I chose to sin. Come on, be a Calvinist, he writes. So here's another atheist who seems to have some knowledge of Calvin's institutes or Calvinism or Reformed theology, not necessarily granting that all Calvinists are going to agree with the way this guy states things. So those are the problems. That's the problem of original sin that people bring up, is that we just have to sin. If we, all of us have to sin. So why would we, be blamed for what we have to do? Now,
okay, if a government creates a rule, and we know that it's impossible to actually live these days in any way without breaking a law, because we don't even know all the laws that are there.
There's a lot of them.
Do we say that the government is forcing me to sin, or the government is forcing me to break the law?
Well, if you don't know about the laws and it's a criminal offense, then you can be let off, because there's the idea of mens rea, guilty mind. Did you break it with intent? But there's a lot of laws we have in this country that whether you knew about them or not, you are still charged and prosecuted.
So if we take that idea to God and we say, even though God created all the rules, he's not forcing me to sin.
Absolutely. And I think there would be a hopefully broad general agreement amongst theologians, whether you're subscribed to your 5-point Calvinist or not.
I don't even know how many points I am, but
yeah. Well, I hate to describe. I about some 20, 30 years ago, I realized from reading the Bible and studying it on a daily basis that I can't really classify myself nicely with any theological classification, because all of them in the end seem to be more, let's say, simplistic than what the Bible actually seems to be implying with its, there's a huge interrelated body of knowledge in there, and things aren't, we tend to want to make theology as, we want to make the things of God simple, and they turn out to be like stick men, how a kid draws stick men, whereas it really lacks dimensionality, it lacks a lot of detail. And that's what I find that any theology that I've studied, and I have studied at a seminary level theology and read various books on it, in the end, there's still things, but you run into the Bible and say, well, wait a sec, that theology we learned, and this is something that I think we all need to remember, is that in the end, no matter how much a fan we are of a particular, of the Apostle Paul or Apollos or John Calvin or whoever, no matter how much a fan we are, in the end, we still have to study and meditate and think about what does the Bible actually say on these things. And the Bible is what fleshes things out on this. So the big issue to me is, and I think to these guys, and we had discussion on, am I going to hell because some guy thousands of years ago screwed up that I had no part in? I couldn't help that he did this. Is that what's going to send me to hell, so to speak? And I'm putting it rather bluntly here. And I would say, no, absolutely not, because the same book of Romans, which I think is golden in trying to at least get a start on discussion. If you just stay in Romans, then you're cherry picking and being selective, because a lot more is expanded on. That when you read Romans, it actually it actually sums things up that are expanded on in other books of the Bible. But when you read the book of Romans, it's like systematic theology. I just love it. And one of the things he tells us is what will condemn us, what will determine our eternal destiny. Let's say, for example, for those people who have not accepted God's salvation from our predicament here, and the predicament is serious, like where you spend eternity, whether you actually in phase 2, like he's created us as 2-phase beings. The first is the mortal phase where we mess up, but we do that in a mortal phase so that then God can give us this plan of redemption, or this plan of salvage, of saving us from this situation. Phase 2 is where we're resurrected in an immortal, eternal, indestructible body with enormous capabilities, godlike capabilities. We're not going to be God, of course, but godlike capabilities that we can't even imagine at this point. And he cannot entrust us with at this point, because we would misuse those capabilities. So that's what lies ahead. Well, that's what God desires us for eternity, for every person. But each person has to decide. And so what determines where you spend eternity is not Adam's original sin. What determines where you spend is spoken of in Romans chapter 2, where he says our own thoughts. And he says there's a law written within our hearts. So even if you've never heard about God, never heard about the Bible, there's still this awareness of good and evil that actually is within our own souls. It's actually God has put within us that awareness. And he says it'll be your own thoughts and conscience that either defends you or condemns you as to where you spend eternity. So you go to your eternal destiny based on your own thoughts and conscience. That is, what did you do with a little bit of information that you had? So let's say, for example, prior to the time of Christ, they didn't know all about Jesus and him dying to pay the penalty, to meet the demands of justice, so that he could then meet the demands of love. They didn't know all the details. They just knew that they sinned, they screwed up, they messed up, and only God can save them from whatever these consequences are. So they still was saved by faith or trust in God. And so that's what determines our eternal destiny. And I think that's the main take-home point I'm trying to make to these guys, these atheists. Both of them, I think, are guys. That Adam's original sin does not determine your eternal destiny. It is you, yourself, your thoughts and conscience that will, at the end of the day, in the day when you stand before God, God will say, well, what did you do? Did you sin against did you violate your own moral conscience?
Now, there is a there is an aspect of sin being passed down, which is why the virgin birth had to happen. Is there not?
I don't know. I mean,
Because it talks about the seed.
Yeah, the seed of the woman. It was the seed of the woman through which salvation would come to humanity, and it seems to have something to do with Adam, the man, deliberately sinning against God here. So I know that I was raised and I was taught, and it doesn't explicitly state this anywhere in Scripture, but that there's some sort of contamination, spiritual contamination or spiritual death or whatever, that's passed down through the man, some sort of sin that's passed down through the man, a state of defilement that's passed down through the man. And for that reason, it is the woman that had to bear, that God chose to become a human being through. And the man is totally out of the picture here. There's no man involved in the virgin birth. Now, as to what that is that's passed down, we don't know. It seems that it's not just an arbitrary choice on God's part. Somehow the sin of humanity has affected even the roles within humanity. And one of those is perhaps the woman bearing God's plan of salvation to the world, because some clarification might be given in 1 Timothy chapter 2, where it says that the woman was deceived, but the man was not. And that's not a good statement about the man. It's not like, oh, I wasn't deceived. No, he did it deliberately, which in God's sight is infinitely worse. Orders of, like, not even orders of magnitude. It's another whole category when you deliberately choose to do wrong, as opposed to you're deceived into doing it, but it wasn't you didn't intentionally want to violate anything. So the woman in that sense is, I hate to use the term, but better in some sense, that she is maybe more innocent than the man. We could use all sorts of different terms, but she doesn't carry the stigma that the man did by intentionally. So that could be one of the reasons. It couldn't be because of what's gone through the man, but the woman still remains the one who did not intentionally commit the original sin. And maybe that's why Christ was born. Or it could be that there is something passed down through the man that is not right. But in the end, is our eternal destiny determined by that? No. Every person individually, it says, will their own thoughts and conscience will either defend them or condemn them.
Yeah, it looks like it was Augustine that actually brought in the idea of original sin being passed down through almost heredity, or it's hereditary.
And I can't say that's true or false. I mean, I spent years thinking about it, discussing it with other people, reading about it, and it's a little vague on what actually gets passed down.
And then you get into infant baptism and all of these different things to try and deal with that. But as we look at this, does it matter what the theology is on this, specifically on whether it's a genetic thing or whether, as the atheist was saying, I don't have a choice. I was born this way. When I think of original sin, it's that I don't have the ability, because of what even what Paul says in Romans, where I do what I do not want to do. My nature makes me do it. God didn't create me with that sin, but when he created us, we were perfect with free will, and with sin entering the world, my default is now screwing up.
That's actually a loaded and very deep question or point of discussion because of infants who die prior to them being able to sin. For example, David's firstborn son by Bathsheba, David says, he cannot come back to me, and he just died as an infant, but I will go to him. And David, as a prophet, if we're going to take that seriously, it seems to indicate that that infant has gone into the presence. Well, they will have eternal life. Then there's the case of Jeroboam's son. Jeroboam was a king of northern Israel who was very evil and wicked, and his whole family was bad, and terrible things were going to happen. But his little boy got sick, and God says his little boy will die, tomorrow or today, whenever you get home. He's talking to the mother here, because in him alone has something good been found in the sight of God. So the question is, do we have to sin? Like, if you're a human and you're conceived, does that automatically mean you're going to have to sin? Well, that's up in the air when you start thinking about infants. And when you start thinking about angels, where only a third of them intentionally chose to fall, to violate God, but 2/3 will always choose to do right. The question then says, well, what about humans? Will they always choose wrongly? Or is there a subcategory that will, if they don't have to live in this world, will never choose to sin, will never exalt themselves to be equal with God and so forth? And that possibility is suggested by the fact that we seem to say that infants and even miscarriages have an eternal soul. We see that in Job and also Ecclesiastes. Though that doesn't mean that all miscarriages go to heaven, or all aborted people who never got to be born automatically spend eternity with God. It doesn't mean that, but it means that some do. At least some do. I'd like to think that all do, but that would be, I would have no grounds for saying that. But
you've had 6 children.
Yeah.
At what age do they intentionally disobey?
I've seen that with our children, where you don't even bother to teach them not to do whatever when they're really small, but there reaches a point where they definitely can't be doing things like eating dirt. For example, our oldest son, when he was born, no dirt eating, like he would eat dirt out of the plants. He just loved it. He just stuffed his face full of it. And what we would do, because we know there could be a problem here, like there are parasites and some of them will kill you. So let's say the fluke, for example, if they get in you, and you can get those by eating dirt. If there happens to be some fluke eggs in there, or fluke larvae or whatever it is. So I witnessed they usually are, at least with our children, knew the difference between obedience and not obedience before they could even talk. But they did know the meaning of the word no. And if it was associated with, let's say, eating dirt, well, we can't have him eating dirt. So he would get his hand slapped, a nice little stinging slap, and immediately, so to associate eating dirt with things. Now, one time my wife witnessed him crawling towards a plant, big planter, and he reached in to grab himself a mouthful, but she was in the other room peeking around the thing. And then he paused, and then he looked around.
Looked to see where Mom was.
Couldn't see either of us, and then reached in and started filling his face full of dirt. Now, that isn't necessarily, though, a moral choice on his part, because there is such a thing as behavioral modification, reward and punishment. And people could say, well, that was just a simple matter of reward and punishment. I don't know at what age, but it's pretty young. It's pretty young.
And that to me is the question, in terms of at what point is the conscience, where it talks about you will be held to the account of what your conscience does, is when does a conscience actually come into play? Because I don't think my dog has a conscience.
No, I don't think so. But behavioral response.
But there is that, if I do this, I get a treat. Yeah. If I do this, I get food. If I do this, I don't get a treat and I get in trouble. Like, I think there's some of that in children.
Yeah.
And so at what point, and I don't think it's the same for everybody.
No, it depends on your cognitive development as to what age you start feeling you're making a moral choice. I remember very clearly as a preschooler, stomping on a frog, although nobody says don't stomp on frogs. I stomped on a frog. And when I did that, I didn't feel good. I felt that that I had done something wrong. And sometimes
But you probably knew before you stomped on that frog.
I knew
I
he
don't
would
think I
die.
should do this.
I hesitated. There was something about stomping on frogs that even as a preschooler didn't sit right with me. And it's not because I grew up in a country. It's not like I went to school and learned about these things. I'm just a kid who played outside most of the time because mom was busy having babies and she was too busy to entertain me all day
Mhm.
long. I entertain myself. But here's something to watch for with a child as they develop. Watch when they start learning to lie. And if you watch them as they begin to tell their first lies, you will see that you haven't told them not to lie. It hasn't been an issue. They've always, did you do this? Yep. But there reaches a point where lying starts and you watch that there's wheels turning in their head. You see that there's a difference in body language, that there's a bit of and a response after they lie. You see a guilt response, even though they've never lied before. You've never punished them for lying. So there's no like learned punishment associated with lying. At that age, I would say that's when they begin moral awareness. And I think we tend to underestimate when that happens. I would say certainly in this preschool years for people who are not experiencing some sort of a mental development challenge, mentally challenged in some way. But for a person who's not experiencing some sort of a mental challenge, it's definitely in this preschool years.
Yeah, and you can even get into sharing and how they act with
Greed.
toys and stuff. Should you have thrown that toy at your sister? Should you have done that? They know they shouldn't have. And then they'll do it again.
Yeah.
And yeah. So and I don't want to get into the theology around where do babies go when they die and those kind of things at this point, because that can be a whole new episode. And I know you've written on the subject before, but it's a very touchy subject, obviously. I guess the thing that we should do to wrap up here is just say, when your conscience kicks in and you're actually able to make decisions based on it, so actually using logic and actually making decisions previous to action based on logic. I think there's a bit of I didn't mean to do that, but now that I've done it, I shouldn't have done it, versus, oh, I totally meant to do that. So intent comes into play.
Yeah.
And I think God does judge on intent, but he doesn't have to only judge on intent. He can judge on, this is a law, you broke it. Can he not?
I'm not so like it's a difficult thing because it actually says where there is no law, this is the Bible, where there is no law, there is no judgment imputed to that person because there was nothing to break. It's pretty hard to commit a criminal offense, and in fact, there's no criminal laws in existence to break. Although even then, you can still be judged on, well, did you violate your own kind of law written within your heart? So it's still there.
And that's sort of where I'm coming at is it, for all have sinned.
Yeah. If you're alive and old enough to listen to this, you've sinned.
Yeah.
I mean, welcome to the club.
Yeah.
The question, practically speaking, though, is regardless of whether we have a proclivity, well, we have to sin or not, when we're born as a human, there is a way out, and the way out is what God offers to us, and you won't be condemned because of how you were born. No, your own thoughts and conscience will condemn or defend you. So there's no injustice here. Yes, we're all in deep trouble. We're all going to die physically. Even the babies who die still need Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead to give them eternal life. So we're not toast. It's still a gift that's offered to humanity, and it depends whether we will accept that gift of eternal life or not, who will receive Christ or not. And if you don't, you're not sent to the other place because of original sin. No, it's your own thoughts and conscience that defend or condemn you on the basis of what did you do with the moral law that was within you. And it's pretty hard to meet someone who says they have never said or done anything that they felt bad about afterwards.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's a bit of I think it's a straw man argument a little bit, just to be saying, well, God's making me do this, blah, blah, blah.
No.
Well, no.
Yeah.
And so if you believe God's making you do this, whether it's warped or thought or not, if God's making you do it, he did also give a way out.
Well, yeah. And why doesn't he make you take the way out? Well, that's another whole different ballgame.
Then we start talking free will again.
But it's pretty clear that God doesn't make someone sin. He does not make people sin. He does not even tempt people. So if the problem is I guess that what that implies when he says your own thoughts or conscience will condemn or defend you, it implies that you actually, even if you've not been spiritually reborn, just as a natural human being with the old nature, you still have the ability to make moral choices, right or wrong. And it is that ability that's going to be called up to the witness stand, and the thoughts and conscience will then start talking. And that's on the basis of what will condemn or defend you. It's not Adam's original sin, which, yeah, we're in trouble, but there is a way out.
Yeah. And again, if you're called up to the stand, you're going to be guilty, just so everybody's aware.
Yeah.
But it's after that Jesus kicks in and says, yeah, but he's with me, or she's with me.
Yeah. I've taken care of that. I've completely blotted out what that person did. In fact, I don't even remember it. Like, that's what God says. It won't even come to mind in eternity, the things that we've done. He says the former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. We will live in a world, if we have received eternal life and that relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we will live in a world that has never known evil and never will know evil. Not even the smallest bit.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you for watching. We're coming up at an hour and 10 here, so we'll have to end it now. I think you're away for a couple of weeks coming up here.
I am away next week. Okay. The week after that, I'm back. If you're back,
I don't know what's going on with me. I do need to take some time off here, so sure. I might be back in a couple of weeks. I might not. Who knows? Maybe I'll have a guest. Maybe Jonathan or someone will join again. Yeah. But thanks all for watching. We'll see you in a week or two, or 2 or 3 weeks. And again, comment, put your stuff in the chat. We do watch it, and we try and respond to all of it. So thank you all. We'll see you next time.